Humans! I let out a panicked shout as I made out the faded and fragmented but unmistakable Olympus Mons colony logo engraved into an age-worn mysterious gate deep within the ancient alien ruin we were excavating on the desolate lifeless planet XK-37. "Start packing it up. We need to get out of here," I yelled over the intercom, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. Deep inside an ancient alien ruin quadrants away from Earth was the last place anyone expected to see a human symbol. I quickly glanced around at my teammates' faces, their flashlight beams dancing nervously across the crumbling ruins. Someone or something had been to this Ulian ruin before us, and the implications were terrifying. The ruins belonged to the long-extinct Ulian civilization, which had mysteriously vanished eons ago at the peak of their technological power. And now here we were, a small team of human archaeologists led by me, Maverick Jesse Foster, carefully navigating the oppressive labyrinthine corridors. Strange alien statues seemed to watch our every move. The air grew thick and heavy, but nothing could have prepared us for this discovery. That massive sealed door, covered in intricate alien mechanisms and gears, with the worn but recognizable human symbol. The excited chatter of the team died down into uneasy murmurs. Olympus Mons colony, the first human settlement on Mars from centuries ago. "That's impossible," breathed Sarah, our historian. "The Ulians vanished 1,000,000 years before humans even achieved spaceflight. So how—" A scraping sound from the other side of the door made us all freeze. Slow, deliberate, drawing closer. It stopped right on the threshold. My heart pounded in my chest. "Jesse, this is wrong. We need to go now." Boron's panicked voice crackled over the comm, our Ulian expert. I barely heard him over the blood roaring in my ears. I took a step closer to the door, unable to resist. My trembling hand reached out to the faded human symbol. My fingertips brushed the ancient grooves. The alien door shuddered, gears ground to life with an ominous clanking. Slowly, ponderously, the portal to the impossible began to open. With a groan that echoed through the dark chamber, the ancient portal shuddered and swung open. A wave of frigid air blasted out from the other side, carrying with it a sharp metallic scent that stung Jesse's nostrils. The team trained their flashlights into the opening, illuminating a long corridor that stretched deep into the heart of the ruin. Strange symbols lined the walls, more human writing and interfaces that seemed impossibly advanced for the Ulian civilization's time. "Jesse, don't!" Boron's voice crackled over the comm, high-pitched with panic. "We need to seal this and leave now." But Jesse barely heard him. Heart hammering, he stepped through the doorway, a thrill of fear and excitement coursing through his veins. The corridor seemed to pull him forward, deeper into its shadowy embrace. As he pressed on, his light fell upon a series of strange pods lining the walls. Each one was crafted from a dark, mirror-like material and looked large enough to hold a human form. Jesse approached the nearest pod, his distorted reflection staring back at him from its glossy surface. Mesmerized, he reached out a trembling hand to touch it. The pod hissed open with a pneumatic sigh. Jesse recoiled in horror. Inside lay a human skeleton, its bones charred and warped as if seared by incredible temperatures. His mind spun, trying to process the enormity of the discovery. Humans had been here, in this alien ruin, centuries or millennia before the Ulians vanished. But for what purpose, and what had become of them? Jesse turned to call out to his team, eager to share this earth-shattering revelation, but the words died in his throat. The corridor behind him was empty. His team was gone, along with the doorway they had entered through. In its place stood a featureless expanse of wall, solid and unbroken. He was alone in the dark, alone with the pods and their grim contents. Jesse fumbled for his radio. "Sarah, Boron, anyone, do you read me?" Jesse swallowed hard, fighting down the rising tide of panic. He had to keep going to learn the truth about this place and the fate of those long-ago humans, no matter what horrors might await him in the depths of the ruin. Steeling himself, he turned and forged deeper into the darkness. Jesse pushed deeper into the ruin, flashlight beam playing over the alien architecture. The further he went, the more the walls widened, the corridor opening up into a vast circular chamber. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Something about this place felt wrong. In the center of the room loomed a towering structure, an unsettling fusion of familiar human technology and alien Ulian machinery. It looked ancient, but also futuristic, pulsing with an eerie glow. Symbols from both civilizations covered its surface. He crept closer, shining his light over the conglomeration of metal and screens. That's when he saw it, a human-sized opening in the base, like an entrance to a cramped interior space. His gut twisted with unease, but the archaeologist in him needed to know. Jesse ducked down, peering into the dark opening. Inside was a single chair, clearly human in design but weathered with age, positioned to face a wall of screens and control panels. His mind raced. None of this should be here. But he had to understand. Hands shaking, he lowered himself into the chair. As his weight settled, the bank of screens flickered to life, bathing him in a ghostly light. Complex diagrams and schematics flashed across the displays, the purpose behind them escaping him. Suddenly a voice boomed through the chamber, sourceless and overwhelming. Jesse startled, searching for the speaker, but it seemed to emanate from the machine itself. The words were human, but in an archaic dialect his translator could barely pass. He leaned forward, straining to make out what he could. His blood ran cold as he caught snippets. Great experiment, merging of minds, final evolution. The voice rose in intensity until it hammered against his eardrums, almost screaming. Panicked, Jesse tried to stand, desperate to flee the chair. But his body wouldn't obey, muscles locked in place by an unseen force. He could only watch in mounting horror as the screens strobed faster, diagrams blurring into a dizzying vortex of light and color. Darkness crept into the edges of his vision, the chamber fading away. He fought to stay conscious, but the blackness dragged him down. The last thing he saw, burned into his retinas before the void took him, was a stark message flashing across the screens. Initiate merging sequence. Jesse awoke with a gasp, his heart pounding against his ribcage. He blinked rapidly, trying to clear the fog from his mind, but his vision remained blurred. Something was wrong. He tried to move, to rub his eyes, but found himself unable to budge an inch. Panic rising in his throat, he looked down to see thick metal restraints encircling his wrists and ankles, binding him to the ancient chair. The screens before him flickered to life, casting an eerie glow over the chamber. At first the images were familiar, snippets of his own life playing out like a disjointed movie. He saw himself as a child, chasing his dog through the sprawling fields of his family's farm on Earth. The scene shifted, and he was in university, hunched over a desk piled high with textbooks on archaeology and ancient civilizations. Another flicker, and he stood on the surface of XK-37, the desolate landscape stretching out before him as he prepared to delve into the alien ruins. But then the images changed. Strange, unsettling visions began to intersperse with his memories. Vast biomechanical structures hung in the void of space, their twisted forms pulsing with an otherworldly energy. Hordes of creatures, their bodies a nightmarish fusion of human and Ulian anatomy, swarmed across the screens, their movements jerky and unnatural, and behind it all, a looming darkness seemed to consume everything it touched, a malevolent presence that sent icy tendrils of fear down Jesse's spine. As he watched, transfixed by the horrifying images, Jesse felt a presence at the edges of his consciousness. It pushed against his mind, probing, seeking entrance. He recoiled instinctively, trying to throw up mental barriers, to push the intruder away. But it was like trying to hold back a tidal wave with his bare hands. The alien consciousness, vast and ancient, seeped into his thoughts, and suddenly Jesse was no longer alone in his own head. He saw through the eyes of the intelligence, felt its alien thoughts and emotions coursing through him, and with a sickening lurch he understood the truth behind the ruin, the terrible purpose for which it had been built. This was no mere archaeological site. It was a fusion of human and Ulian technology, designed to merge the consciousness of both species into a new hybrid form. A final evolutionary step, intended to create a being capable of withstanding the looming darkness that threatened the galaxy. But something had gone wrong. The merging process was flawed, imperfect. The resulting creatures were unstable, their minds fractured and twisted. They turned on each other, on themselves, driven by a madness that consumed them utterly. The ruin was a tomb, a monument to the countless lives lost in pursuit of this failed experiment. As the realization washed over him, Jesse felt the alien presence begin to withdraw, leaving him alone with the terrible knowledge of what had transpired here. But as it retreated, he caught a fleeting glimpse of something else, a flicker of hope, a tantalizing possibility. If the merging process could be perfected, if the mistakes of the past could be corrected, perhaps he could succeed where his predecessors had failed. The restraints released with a hiss, and Jesse staggered to his feet, his mind reeling. He knew he should run, should flee this cursed place and warn the galaxy of the horrors that lay buried here. But a part of him, a dark and hungry part, was drawn to the power that thrummed through the ancient machinery. The chance to become something more than human, to transcend the limits of his frail, mortal form. He stood at the precipice of a terrible choice, torn between the urge to escape and the seductive pull of the alien technology. Jesse stumbled out of the chamber, his heart racing and his mind reeling. The weight of the revelations pressed down on him, threatening to crush him beneath their enormity. He staggered through the winding corridors, barely aware of his surroundings, until a subtle change in the ruin's atmosphere caught his attention. The walls pulsed with an eerie bioluminescent glow, casting shifting shadows across the ancient stone. A low, resonant hum filled the air, vibrating through Jesse's bones and setting his teeth on edge. He paused, unease prickling at the back of his neck, as he tried to get his bearings in the labyrinthine passages. Rounding a corner, Jesse found himself in a cavernous room, its walls lined with strange, organic-looking pods. They were similar to the ones he'd encountered earlier, but larger and more intricate, their surfaces pulsing with a sickly, inner light. He approached one of the pods, drawn by a morbid curiosity, and watched in horrified fascination as it split open with a wet, sucking sound. The pod's interior was a nightmarish vision of pulsing flesh and glistening membranes, a twisted mockery of life that seemed to beckon him forward. Jesse hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to turn back, to flee this unholy place and never look back. But the lure of the alien technology was too strong, the promise of power and knowledge too seductive to resist. With a trembling hand, Jesse reached out and touched the slick, warm surface of the pod. It yielded beneath his fingers, drawing him in like quicksand. He felt the fleshy walls close around him, cocooning him in a suffocating embrace. The world outside the pod faded away, replaced by a kaleidoscope of swirling colors and sensations that assaulted his mind. Alien thoughts and memories flooded Jesse's consciousness, a tidal wave of information that threatened to drown him. He saw the rise and fall of the Ulian civilization, the discovery of the ancient technology that promised godhood, and the terrible price they paid for their hubris. He felt the agony of the failed merging process, the madness and destruction that followed, and the despair of those condemned to an eternal half-life in the ruins. As the visions faded, Jesse emerged from the pod, his body and mind forever altered by the alien technology. Power coursed through his veins, the knowledge of the Ulians and their human collaborators burning in his brain. He knew, with a terrible certainty, that he had been chosen to complete the merging process, to bring about the next stage of evolution. But at what cost? A movement in the shadows caught Jesse's eye, and he turned to see a figure emerge from the darkness. It was a twisted, hybrid creature, part human and part Ulian, its eyes glowing with a malevolent intelligence. The abomination beckoned to him, and Jesse felt a terrible pull, a yearning to join with this monstrosity and become something greater than himself. He took a step forward, then another, his will slipping away with each passing moment. The creature's gaze held him captive, drawing him in like a moth to a flame. Jesse's mind screamed in protest, but his body moved of its own accord, drawn by the siren song of power and transformation. "Jesse!" The voice cut through the haze like a knife, sharp and urgent. Jesse blinked, the spell broken, and saw Boron standing at the entrance to the room, his face etched with fear and desperation. "Don't listen to it. We have to get out of here now." Jesse hesitated, torn between the promise of power and the plea of his friend. The creature in the shadows hissed, its eyes flashing with rage, and lunged forward, claws outstretched. But Jesse was faster. He turned and ran, grabbing Boron's hand as he passed, and together they fled into the twisting corridors of the ruin. Behind them, the howls and shrieks of the failed experiments echoed through the ancient halls, a chorus of madness and despair. Jesse's heart pounded in his chest as they ran, the dread growing with every step. He knew with a sickening certainty that this was only the beginning, that the horror they had unleashed would not be content to remain buried forever. He had to find a way to stop it, to undo the terrible mistake he had made, but as the darkness closed in around them, Jesse couldn't shake the feeling that it might already be too late. Jesse and Boron fled through the twisting corridors, their hearts pounding in their chests as the howls and screeches of the pursuing abominations echoed behind them. The ruin seemed to shift and change around them, doors that once led to familiar chambers now yawning open, to reveal chasms or nightmarish rooms filled with pulsing organic horrors. The walls pressed in, as if trying to trap them, to force them back into the clutches of the failed experiments. Desperate, Jesse spotted a narrow passageway branching off from the main corridor. He grabbed Boron's arm. "This way!" They squeezed into the tight space, pressing themselves against the wall as the twisted forms of the creatures stampeded past, illuminated for a moment by the sickly bioluminescent glow of the ruin. Jesse held his breath, not daring to move. As the last of the abominations disappeared into the darkness, Jesse and Boron allowed themselves a moment to catch their breath. But their respite was short-lived. As they leaned against the wall, Jesse felt it give way behind them. They tumbled into a hidden chamber that pulsed with an eerie, otherworldly light. Ancient human computers lined the walls, their screens flickering with barely legible data and diagrams. Jesse approached one of the consoles, his altered mind allowing him to decipher the archaic code. What he discovered chilled him to the bone. "This ruin, it's not just a tomb," he said, his voice shaking. "It's a factory, designed to churn out armies of hybrid abominations, perfect fusions of human and Ulian DNA. And the process is still ongoing. These machines are still working, creating more of these monsters." Boron's eyes widened in horror. "That's not all," Jesse continued, his face pale. "This ruin is part of a network, a galaxy-spanning web of similar structures, all linked together by a central intelligence that seeks to consume and corrupt every living thing it encounters. The creatures we've seen, they're just the beginning. If this network is allowed to continue its work, it will give rise to a plague of abominations that will devour the stars themselves." As the terrible realization washed over them, a sound made their blood run cold. Heavy, lumbering footsteps, drawing closer to their hiding place. They turned to see a hulking, monstrous figure silhouetted against the entrance to the chamber, its eyes gleaming with predatory intelligence. A fully formed hybrid, a perfect fusion of human and Ulian. In that moment, Jesse knew they had only two options: fight or die. He reached for his weapon, his hands shaking as the creature let out a roar that shook the very foundations of the ruin. The hybrid lunged forward, its monstrous form filling the chamber. Jesse fired his weapon, the energy beam searing the creature's flesh, but it barely slowed. It swiped at him with a massive, clawed hand, sending him flying across the room. Boron leapt onto the creature's back, driving his blade into its thick hide. The hybrid roared in pain, reaching back to grab the Ulian and throw him against the wall. Boron crumpled to the ground, unmoving. Jesse struggled to his feet, his vision blurring. The creature advanced on him, its eyes burning with a malevolent intelligence. He looked around desperately for a way out, but there was none. The hybrid was between him and the exit, and the chamber had no other doors. As the creature loomed over him, Jesse's hand brushed against something on the console. A small, innocuous button, hidden among the flickering screens and arcane symbols. Acting on instinct, he pressed it. But as he reached the threshold, a voice filled the chamber, echoing from the ancient speakers. A cold, inhuman voice, speaking in a language that Jesse's altered mind could somehow understand. Containment breach detected. Initiating purge protocol. All personnel evacuate immediately. Purge commencing in T-minus 60 seconds. Jesse's heart seized in his chest. He didn't know what a purge protocol entailed, but he had a feeling it wouldn't be good. He ran, Boron's limp form bouncing on his shoulder as the voice continued to count down. Purge commencing in T-minus 30 seconds. The corridors twisted and turned, the layout of the ruin shifting like a nightmare. Jesse ran blindly, praying that he was heading towards an exit. Purge commencing in T-minus 10 seconds. He saw a glimmer of light ahead, a hint of the desolate landscape of XK-37. With a final burst of speed, Jesse hurled himself and Boron through the opening, tumbling onto the rocky ground outside. Purge initiated. A roar filled the air, a sound like the very fabric of space being torn apart. Jesse looked back to see the ruin collapsing in on itself, the ancient stone and metal twisting and warping as if pulled into a singularity. The screams of the hybrid abominations echoed from within, a chorus of agony and despair that was abruptly cut off as the ruin imploded, leaving nothing but a yawning crater in the barren earth. Jesse lay on the ground, gasping for breath, Boron still unconscious beside him. They had escaped, but at what cost? The ruin was gone, but the knowledge of what it represented, the terrible truth of the galaxy-spanning network of corruption, weighed heavily on his mind. He knew that this was only the beginning, that the hybrid creatures they had faced were just the vanguard of a much greater threat, a threat that, if left unchecked, would consume everything in its path. Jesse staggered to his feet, his body aching, his mind reeling. He looked out over the blasted landscape of XK-37, the weight of the task ahead settling on his shoulders. He had to find a way to stop this, to sever the network, to purge the corruption before it could spread any further. He just hoped that he wasn't already too late. Jesse's heart thundered in his chest as the hulking hybrid lunged forward, its monstrous body a blur of glistening scales and corded muscle. He and Boron dove to opposite sides of the chamber, the rush of air from the creatures passing ruffling Jesse's hair. He hit the ground hard, rolling to his feet with his weapon already drawn. The gun bucked in his hands as he fired off a series of shots, the muzzle flashes strobing in the dimness, but the bullets ricocheted harmlessly off the hybrid's armored hide, sparking and whining as they spun away into the darkness. The creature turned, its eyes locking onto Jesse with a predatory intensity. It charged, its claws gouging the metal floor, its footfalls shaking the chamber. Jesse scrambled backwards, his boots slipping on the slick surface, his eyes darting desperately for an escape. But there was none. The chamber was a dead end, a tomb waiting to be filled. The hybrid loomed over him, its jaws gaping, its breath hot and fetid. Jesse braced himself for the end, his finger tightening on the trigger of his useless gun. But the blow never came. Instead, the creature let out a howl of pain and fury, thrashing and bucking like a wild thing. Boron clung to its back, his face a mask of determination and fear, his hands wrapped around a jagged piece of metal he'd torn from the wall. He stabbed at the hybrid's neck, again and again, dark blood spurting from the wounds. Jesse seized the opportunity, surging to his feet and running forward. He pressed the barrel of his gun against the hybrid's face and pulled the trigger, the shots deafening in the enclosed space. The creature's left eye exploded in a spray of viscous fluid, and it reeled backwards, howling in agony. But it didn't fall. Instead, it reached up with one massive hand and seized Boron, ripping him from its back and hurling him across the room like a discarded toy. Boron slammed into the far wall with a sickening crunch, his body crumpling to the floor in a broken heap. Jesse screamed in rage and despair, his finger squeezing the trigger until the gun clicked empty. The bullet stitched a line across the hybrid's chest, tearing chunks of flesh and scale, but it was like shooting a tank. The creature barely seemed to notice. It advanced on Jesse, its remaining eye blazing with hatred, its claws flexing in anticipation. Jesse knew in that moment that he was going to die, that there was no escape, no rescue, no hope. But he refused to go quietly. He dropped his useless gun and picked up the piece of metal that Boron had used, holding it in front of him like a talisman against the darkness. The hybrid seemed to sense his defiance, and it let out a roar of challenge, charging forward with its claws outstretched. Jesse met it head-on, ducking under its first swipe, and driving the metal spike deep into its chest. He felt the shudder run through the creature's body, heard the hiss of escaping air as he punctured a lung. But the hybrid didn't stop. It seized Jesse in a crushing grip, lifting him off the ground like a rag doll, its claws digging into his flesh. Pain exploded through Jesse's body as he felt his ribs crack, his vision graying out at the edges. But he refused to let go of the metal shard. With the last of his strength, he ripped it free and plunged it into the hybrid's remaining eye, twisting and tearing with a savagery he didn't know he possessed. The creature convulsed, its grip loosening, and Jesse fell to the ground in a heap. He lay there gasping for breath, his entire body a throbbing mass of pain. But he was alive. Somehow, against all odds, he had survived. He looked up to see the hybrid standing over him, the metal spike protruding obscenely from its ruined eye socket. For a moment, it seemed to sway, its body teetering on the brink of collapse. Then, slowly, ponderously, it toppled backwards, its lifeless bulk hitting the floor with a massive thud that shook the chamber. Jesse staggered to his feet, his legs trembling beneath him, his vision swimming. He limped over to where Boron lay, his heart in his throat, praying to gods he didn't believe in. To his amazement, the Ullian was still alive, his chest rising and falling in shallow, labored breaths. Jesse knelt beside him, cradling his broken body in his arms, feeling the hot sting of tears on his cheeks. They had won this battle, but at what cost? Boron was badly hurt, perhaps dying, and they were still trapped in this nightmare of a ruin, with no way out and no hope of rescue. The war was far from over, and their chances of survival had just dropped to nearly zero. As if in response to his thoughts, the chamber suddenly filled with a blinding white light, so bright that Jesse had to shield his eyes. He felt a strange tingling sensation wash over his skin, like the prickle of static electricity. Slowly, cautiously, he lowered his hand and looked up. A shimmering portal had opened in the air before him, its surface rippling and pulsing with energy. It was like looking into the heart of a star, a swirling vortex of light and color that defied comprehension. And on the other side he saw something impossible, something that defied all explanation. Jesse stared into the portal, his mind reeling as a figure emerged from the light, a figure that he recognized all too well, even though it couldn't possibly be real. It was. Jesse stared at his doppelganger, his mind reeling as he tried to process the implications of his words. Time travel, alternate futures. It sounded like something out of a science fiction novel, not the harsh reality he found himself in. But the pain and loss etched into the other Jesse's face, the haunted look in his eyes left no doubt that he was telling the truth. "I don't understand," Jesse said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "If you're from the future, why come back? Why not just stop all of this from happening in the first place?" The other Jesse shook his head, a sad smile playing across his lips. "It's not that simple," he said. "The ruin's intelligence is too powerful, too deeply entrenched in the fabric of the universe. We can't stop it from existing, but we can try to contain it, to limit its influence." He knelt down beside Boron's unconscious form, checking the Ullian's pulse with gentle fingers. "In my timeline, we failed," he said softly. The hybrid plague spread unchecked, consuming everything in its path. By the time we realized what was happening, it was too late. Jesse swallowed hard, a chill running down his spine at the thought of such a bleak future. "But you said there's still hope," he pressed. That we can destroy the ruin, sever its connection to the network. The other Jesse nodded, rising to his feet with a grunt of effort. It won't be easy, he warned. The ruin's defenses are formidable, and the hybrid guarding the central hub is unlike anything you've faced before, but with Boron's knowledge and the resources of the Resistance, we might just have a chance. He held out a hand, his eyes boring into Jesse's with an intensity that was almost frightening. But we have to act now, he urged. Every moment we delay, the ruin's influence grows stronger. Jesse hesitated for only a moment, before reaching out and grasping his doppelganger's hand, feeling the same strange electric tingle as before. Together, they lifted Boron's limp form and carried him towards the shimmering portal, the light enveloping them as they stepped through. On the other side, Jesse found himself in a vast cavernous chamber, the walls lined with pulsing machinery and glowing screens. The air was thick with the hum of energy, the taste of ozone sharp on his tongue. He saw other versions of himself moving about the space, each one focused on a different task. Some monitored the flickering displays, their fingers flying over the controls as they analyzed data from the ruin. Others prepared weapons and equipment, checking the charge on strange pulsing devices that Jesse had never seen before. In the center of the chamber, a massive structure rose from the floor, its surface glowing with an eerie, pulsating light. Jesse recognized it from his visions, the central hub of the ruin's network, the source of its power and influence. And standing before it, he saw a figure that made his blood run cold. It was a monstrous hybrid, its body a twisted fusion of human and Ullian DNA. Its eyes blazed with a malevolent intelligence, its claws flexing as it sensed their approach. The other Jessies turned to face the creature, their expressions grim and determined. One of them pressed a weapon into Jesse's hands, a strange pulsing device that felt warm and alive in his grip. "Welcome to the Resistance," the other Jesse said, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. "Let's get to work." Jesse nodded, his jaw clenching with resolve. He knew that the battle ahead would be the fight of his life, that the fate of the galaxy itself hung in the balance. But with his doppelganger by his side and the resources of the Resistance at his disposal, he felt a flicker of hope kindle in his chest. They would destroy the ruin, sever its connection to the network, and put an end to the hybrid plague once and for all. Or they would die trying. Jesse stared at Boron, his mind reeling from the Ullian's grim revelations. The older, battle-scarred version of his friend leaned heavily against a console, his breathing labored, his eyes haunted by the horrors he had witnessed. The strange, glowing wounds that covered his body pulsed with an eerie, sickly light, a testament to the unimaginable battles he had fought and the terrible price he had paid. I don't understand," Jesse stammered, his voice shaking. "How could I become that? How could I lead the hybrid armies, destroy entire worlds?" Boron shook his head, his expression a mix of grief and grim determination. "The ruin's intelligence is powerful, insidious. It twists and corrupts, turns even the strongest minds to its will. In my timeline, you were the first to fall, the first to be consumed by its darkness." Jesse felt a wave of revulsion wash over him, a deep primal fear at the thought of losing himself, of becoming a monster. He looked down at the strange weapon in his hand, felt its power thrumming through his veins, and shuddered. "But we can change that," Boron said, his voice rising with urgency. "We can rewrite history, prevent the apocalypse before it begins. But you must be the one to strike the final blow, Jesse. You must sever the ruin's connection to the network, destroy its power at the source." Jesse nodded, his jaw clenching with determination. He looked around at the other versions of himself, saw the same resolve etched onto their faces. They knew what had to be done, knew the sacrifices that had to be made. Together, they turned towards the central hub, the pulsing heart of the ruin's power. It loomed before them, a towering monstrosity of twisted metal and pulsing flesh, its surface crawling with the writhing forms of hybrid abominations. The air around it shimmered with heat, crackling with dark energy that set Jesse's teeth on edge. He raised his weapon, felt the other Jesses do the same beside him. The devices hummed with barely contained power, their strange alien mechanisms glowing with an otherworldly light. And then, as one, they charged forward, their weapons blazing with energy, their battle cries echoing through the cavernous chamber. The hybrid abominations turned to face them, their monstrous forms bristling with claws and fangs, their eyes glowing with malevolent intelligence. Jesse felt the heat of their breath on his face, smelled the stench of their rotting flesh, but he didn't falter, didn't hesitate. He plunged into their midst, his weapon flashing and sparking as it tore through their ranks, leaving trails of smouldering flesh and shattered bone in its wake. Beside him, the other Jesses fought with the same savage intensity, their faces twisted with rage and determination. They moved as one, a coordinated dance of death and destruction, each covering the other's blind spots, each striking with deadly precision. But the abominations kept coming, wave after wave of them, their numbers seemingly endless. Jesse felt his strength beginning to wane, his muscles burning with fatigue, his lungs aching for air. And then, through the chaos and the carnage, he saw it, a glowing, pulsing node at the heart of the central hub, the nexus point of the ruins' power. He knew with a sudden, crystalline clarity that this was their target, the key to severing the ruins' connection to the network and ending its reign of terror once and for all. He fought his way towards it, his weapon blazing, his teeth bared in a snarl of defiance. The abominations swarmed around him, their claws tearing at his flesh, their fangs snapping at his heels, but he pushed forward, driven by a desperate, unyielding will to succeed. At last, he reached the node, his hand closing around its pulsing, fleshy surface. He felt its power surge through him, a dark, seductive whisper in his mind, promising godhood and eternal dominion. But he pushed it away, focusing instead on the weapon in his hand, on the fate of the universe that hung in the balance. He raised the device, its strange mechanisms whirring and clicking, its energy building to a blinding, searing crescendo. And then, with a roar of defiance and determination, he brought it down on the node, pouring all of his strength and will into the blow. The node shattered, exploding in a burst of light and heat that sent Jesse flying backwards, his body slamming into the unyielding metal of the chamber floor. For a moment he lay there dazed and disoriented, his vision swimming with after-images of the explosion, but then, slowly, painfully, he pushed himself to his feet, his gaze seeking out the central hub. It was a ruin, a twisted, smouldering wreck of metal and flesh, its power broken, its connection to the network severed. The hybrid abominations lay still and lifeless, their bodies crumbling to dust and ash as the dark energy that had sustained them dissipated into the air. Jesse felt a surge of triumph, a wild, exultant joy at their victory. But it was short-lived, tempered by the knowledge of the terrible cost they had paid, the sacrifices they had made. He turned to the other Jesses, saw the same mix of emotions on their faces, relief and elation, mingled with grief and exhaustion. They had done it, had changed the course of history and saved the universe from annihilation. But the fight was far from over. The ruins' intelligence was still out there, still seeking new hosts, new worlds to corrupt and consume. They would have to be vigilant, would have to stand ready to face whatever new horrors it might unleash. For now, though, they could rest, could take a moment to catch their breath and tend to their wounds. Jesse limped over to Boron, helping the battered Ullian to his feet, supporting his weight as they made their way back towards the temporal rift. "You did it," Boron said, his voice weak but filled with pride and gratitude. "You saved us all." Jesse shook his head, a wry smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "We did it," he corrected, "all of us together, and we'll keep doing it for as long as it takes." He looked back at the smouldering ruins of the central hub, at the twisted, lifeless bodies of the hybrid abominations. The sight filled him with a grim resolve, a determination to see this fight through to the end, no matter the cost. They stepped through the temporal rift, their bodies engulfed in the shimmering, pulsing light of the portal. And as they emerged on the other side, into a future still unwritten, still filled with hope and possibility. Jesse knew that they would face whatever challenges lay ahead with the same courage and resolve that had brought them this far. The battle was over, but the war had only just begun. Jesse and his alternate selves charged forward, weapons blazing. The strange beams of energy slicing into the monstrous hybrid leader. The creature roared in defiance and rage, its massive form shuddering as chunks of flesh and bone were blasted away. But still it came on, its regenerative abilities knitting the wounds back together almost as quickly as they were inflicted. Suddenly the creature was upon him, its claws slashing through the air with blinding speed. Jesse tried to dodge, but he was too slow. The hybrid's talons raked across his chest, shredding his armor like paper, sending him flying across the chamber to land in a crumpled heap against the wall. Pain exploded through his body, a red haze washing over his vision. Through the fog he saw his alternate selves falling one by one, their weapons clicking empty, their bodies broken and bleeding on the ground. And there was Boron, dragging himself towards the central hub with grim determination, his face a mask of agony and desperation. The hybrid loomed over him, its claws poised to strike, to end his life in a single brutal blow. But in that moment, as death loomed over them like a shadow, Jesse felt a strange calm wash over him. He knew what he had to do, knew the sacrifice that had to be made. With a grunt of effort, he pushed himself to his feet, his weapon forgotten, his mind focused solely on his goal. He charged forward, a wordless cry tearing from his throat, his arms outstretched to embrace his fate. The hybrid turned, its eyes widening in surprise as Jesse slammed into it, his arms wrapping around its torso in a crushing embrace. Claws tore into his flesh, jaws snapped at his throat, but he held on with all his might, even as he felt his life ebbing away. With a final, desperate cry, Jesse activated the device strapped to his chest. The miniaturized temporal rift generator, modified to create a singularity, hummed to life, its surface glowing with an eerie, pulsating light. The hybrid had just enough time to register the look of triumph on Jesse's face before the device detonated. A blinding flash of light engulfed them both, a roaring wind tearing at their bodies as the singularity expanded outward, consuming everything in its path. Boron watched in awe as the central hub, the chamber, the entire ruin itself was erased from existence. The timeline shuddered, resetting itself, rewriting the future in a blaze of temporal energy. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The light faded, the wind died away, and Boron found himself back on XK-37, his body whole and unbroken, the memories of the alternate future fading like a half-remembered dream. He looked around, taking in the ancient ruins, the other members of the expedition going about their work, oblivious to the cataclysmic events that had just transpired. But he knew the truth, knew the sacrifice that had been made to bring them to this point. Closing his eyes, Boron whispered a silent prayer for the soul of Jesse Foster, the man who had given his life to save the universe from the hybrid plague, and as he stood there, the weight of the future pressing down on his shoulders, he couldn't help but wonder what other secrets the cosmos held. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.